If you make a list of the world's richest countries by GDP, you'll find the US in 7th place. But if you make a list of all the countries with the most debt, you'll find the US ranked at number 12. Doesn't that pose a big question mark? Why does the US rank high when it comes to both lists? How can a superpower like the USA make big money and have huge debt? Is there a flaw in the budget? Or poor decision-making on the senator's part? In this video, we'll be exploring how the US spends more than it earns, securing a position in the list of top 20 countries with the most debt. We start our investigation by looking at US spending, since it's the main culprit here. When it comes to your own spending, you probably break it down into lists, like groceries, bills, and entertainment. But when we're talking about a country, the expenditure gets split into two categories: mandatory spending and discretionary spending. Mandatory spending includes everything that the government must pay for under the law. We're talking about Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And in 2023, the U.S. government spent $4.2 trillion in this department, which accounts for 2/3 of the total federal expenditure. As for discretionary spending, well, this includes all the categories that congressmen sit down and decide every year, like the national defense and education. In 2023, discretionary spending amounted to approximately $1.9 trillion, which is about 1/3 of the total expenditure. Add them up, and you get $6.134 trillion in total expenditure for the year 2023. Looking at the numbers, it doesn't seem like the government is making bad decisions in this department. So, is it the revenue then? Of course, the government doesn't get the money for expenditures by asking the tooth fairy to leave some extra notes under the pillow. They need an income stream, or in this case, a revenue stream. The government gets about 50% of its earnings from individual income taxes, and in 2023, they collected about $2.2 trillion from the public. Payroll taxes made up 37% of the total revenue, amounting to $1.6 trillion. Then there's the corporate income taxes that represented about 7% of the total revenue, aka $372 billion. Excise taxes, customs duties, and miscellaneous sources fill the government's pockets by $500 billion. Add all of that, and you've got $4.439 trillion. At first glance, it seems like the USA is making decent money. So why is there an issue? Why is there a deficit of $1.695 trillion? Well, the answer lies in what we discussed before: mandatory spending. You see, the population's not growing any smaller, and as healthcare costs rise, programs like Medicare and Social Security demand more money. In fact, it's a department that the U.S. has struggled with for many years. Back in 2021, the U.S. government spent approximately $6.8 trillion, which exceeded the country's revenue by $2.7 trillion. Even back then, Social Security and healthcare programs were to be blamed, since each of them ate up $1.1 trillion and $1 trillion of the budget, respectively. But that's only the tip of the iceberg. Interest payments on debt are yet another reason why the U.S.'s budget is in the red. Over the years, the U.S.'s debt has only gone up, instead of down, which puts the country at a disadvantage because of the interest. As the national debt increases, the interest payments needed to pay off the debt increase as well. For the year 2023, interest payments made up $400 billion of the budget.
So there are three big forces that have been at work, and I think you have to understand those. First is the debt money thing. How much debt and money, and what are the repercussions? How does that pass through the economy? What does that mean for markets, inflation, and so on?
Defense expenditure could be blamed as well. Regardless of the country's economic situation, the defense budget doesn't go down. Up? Sure. But it would be a cold day in hell before the Americans decide to cut back on military spending. In 2023, defense took up 13% of the total budget. And let's not forget that the country's coming out of a pandemic right now. So we've got lower incomes and corporate profits. Meanwhile, the spending on safety net programs is not going down. Think of it this way. You've got 5 carrots, and every day 5 rabbits come to you to get fed. Well, one day you get 6 rabbits, and then 7, and then 8, and the number steadily goes up. But the number of carrots remains the same, and even worse, they're not the juiciest carrots in the market. Now, it's not the best analogy, but that's essentially what's happening here. If you get our point, let us know in the comments section below. Well, coming back to the discussion, you've got rising expenditures and revenue streams that simply can't keep up. So, if they can't keep up, does that mean that the government can afford the luxury of turning a blind eye to the situation? Well, policymakers can't ignore the situation even if they want to. You see, spending more than your earnings means that the government needs more money. And like we said, the government doesn't have a magic pot of gold. And so, in this situation, the US government goes to the IMF's door with its tail between its legs and asks for some cash. And that's a lose-lose situation for everyone. One reason we've already talked about before: high levels of debt lead to increased interest rates since the government is competing for borrowing in financial markets. And that doesn't work for private investment since they're on the losing end. And if you remember, we said that private tax collections make up a significant part of the revenue stream. So if these guys are not doing well, then the government can't really cover that deficit now, can it? As of June 3, 2024, the US government had a debt of $34.6 trillion. In these circumstances, the government is left with no choice but to increase taxes, which is obviously bad for us, the public. In fact, according to the US Treasury, President Joe Biden's proposed US government budget would raise tax receipts by $4.951 trillion over 10 years, including more than $2.7 trillion in tax hikes on businesses and nearly $2 trillion on wealthy individuals and estates. He promised the plans as part of his election year budget wish list. Though it's a setback, he did plan to introduce new programs to help out low and middle-income Americans with ridiculously high housing and childcare costs. But let's stick to the point here. A deficit means more taxes, which is a death sentence when it comes to personal economic opportunities. But more importantly, it also affects the government's ability to lend a helping hand during a crisis. How's that? Well, a high debt-to-GDP ratio leaves the authorities with little fiscal policy flexibility. For those of you who are not finance bros, fiscal policy flexibility refers to the ability of a government to adjust its fiscal policies, such as taxation, government spending, and borrowing. Now, we know the picture that we've painted here looks very grim, but the truth is that the US has been dealing with these circumstances for a long time now. See, if we look at the numbers from the past years, it'll show you that the country's debt to GDP rises during economic recessions. Those in the 1980s and 2008 to 2009 left a huge impact on US debt. In fact, you could say that we've been dealing with the aftermath of those recessions for a long time now. The government was forced to borrow money even during the American Revolution. More recently, the COVID-19 pandemic forced the country to ask for money, raising the debt-to-GDP ratio from 106% in late 2019 to 133% by Q2 2020. The reason why we're talking about the US's debt history is that every time policymakers borrowed money, they were spending more than they were earning. Now, we know what you're thinking. If the US has such a long history of debt and budget deficit, then what's the problem? Why is this a situation that needs to be addressed? Can't we just carry on like this? It's not like the country's going under. Well, the answer's simple. It's not a sustainable model. And here's what Bill Dudley, the former New York Fed president, has to say about it.
Reasons. Number one, unsustainable trends always have to come to an end, so we know that this can't go on indefinitely. Number two, the situation is bad and it's probably going to get worse. The Congressional Budget Office assumptions are actually pretty optimistic. They don't have a recession in their forecast over the next 10 years. They assume that the tax cuts that were enacted in 2017 expire, so that flatters the deficit. So things are probably going to be even worse.
So the next question is, how can policymakers solve the issue of spending more than what they're earning? Despite the unfavorable circumstances, there's hope. Authorities can take several measures to combat the situation. In fact, several economists have a lot of pointers for the government. Philip Swagel, the former United States Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Economic Policy, published an article talking about all the avenues the government could explore. According to him, even if the government chose to go with 10 of his suggested options, and those 10 options reduce the deficit by, say, $500 billion each over the next 10 years, it could lead us to a $5 trillion primary deficit reduction. And if the deficit goes down, the government will be able to save more on net interest payments. It's a win-win situation. So, what are these options? Putting a limit on federal spending on Medicaid, as well as state taxes on healthcare providers, increasing the premiums paid for Medicare Part B, setting Social Security benefits to a flat amount, reducing spending on other mandatory programs, reducing the Department of Defense's annual budget, reducing Social Security benefits for high earners, and reducing non-defense discretionary spending. He also suggested imposing a tax on consumption, a new payroll tax, and a tax on emissions of greenhouse gases. Now, understanding how each of these measures could reduce the budget deficit is a whole other debate, but the point is that a solution exists, or several to be exact. It's all about policymakers being a little more creative and making smarter decisions, like trying out innovation. If we look at the U.S.'s history, there are several instances where the government's decision to invest in innovative solutions has paid off. Take the 1980s and 1990s, when the federal government backed several state and local welfare reform programs. These programs focused on moving welfare recipients quickly into the workforce through short-term job search assistance and training. And the result? An increase in employment and earnings of 20% to 50%. The government also managed to increase their savings by $1,700 to $6,000 per person in terms of reduced welfare and food stamps. And so the budget deficit is not something that policymakers can push under the carpet. It demands urgent action. Once a balance is attained, the country will be on track for long-term economic stability and sustainability. Even a small reduction in the budget deficit will go a long way. If you enjoyed this content, check out another one of our videos on our channel. Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.